All right, today I'd like to talk about simulation theory. There's been a lot of talk about the concept of simulation theory, specifically that what if what we know as reality is really just a simulation in a computer. I think this is a fun sci-fi idea to think about. What I find interesting about it is what if, right? It reminds me of the comic books back in the 90s where they would have like the what if series, and they would take a famous, comic book hero or established brand, and then they would put in an impossible scenario that they don't actually want to commit to for the timeline, because they're always doing timeline things. But they're like, well, wouldn't it be cool? It's like, what if the X-Men went and fought, someone from the DC universe? Like, what if the Hulk versus Superman, Batman versus, Iron Man? Those kind of what if scenarios. That created a lot of crossovers. So let's step back there for a moment. So basically what you're doing is you're taking one creative group or set of authors and artists brand, DC, versus Marvel. So basically, you're taking this one group of people that work with each other, talk about their ideas, have their own established fan base, have their own aesthetic looks, basically create this little universe that they're the creators of. And so in this universe, in order to make their comic books more interesting or sell, they kind of establish timelines. They start to establish a theme or a genre that they want to talk about. So in Batman the Dark Knight, it was basically your anti-hero. Instead of it being like Superman, which is another DC character where he's just super, he's great at everything. He's almost like a god slash alien, or an alien posing as a god amongst Earthlings. It was kind of like, well, what if we just had mere mortals, right? Like as the hero and do vigilante and clean up the streets of Gotham, or, this person more like a warrior or a soldier who's fatally flawed for many reasons. He does bad things for the greater good. Maybe he's a billionaire playboy that allows him to, have all these fancy, cool tech stuff that gives him extraordinary abilities that Superman doesn't require. Because Superman already is awesome. He's already a god. He can already shoot laser beams out of his eyes. He can already fly. He's the Man of Steel. He's bulletproof, right? So he doesn't need all these special whiz-bang gadget thingies. So Batman and Superman kind of balance each other out in the sense that Superman is a godlike character, and his backstory actually turns into sci-fi alien woo-woo stuff. And Batman is a mortal anti-hero vigilante billionaire playboy who can be killed, but because he has all this cool tech which gives him magic-like abilities, kind of compare the two, like man versus science or God versus science. In the Marvel universe, their equivalent to Batman would be Iron Man. So Tony Stark, billionaire playboy, narcissistic, I guess is how they would characterize him today. But basically, is a super genius, invents an iron suit that gives him godlike abilities, and then with magic is able to create drones or artificial intelligence and all these sort of things. The opposite of Iron Man in the Marvel universe would be the Hulk, where it's just pure anger or pure emotion. So it's not a scientific genius thing. It's more like brutal Hulk smash, brawn over muscle, or brains over muscle sort of thing. So the Hulk would be the muscle and Iron Man would be the brains. So you have these dueling universes that are dealing with similar concepts, except that divided by the fact that they're two different corporations and that they're filled with different sets of artists and writers, and they're both exploring their own imagination. But what about if they were to cross the rules and the heroes that they created in one world, or i.e. the Marvel universe, with characters in the DC universe? And so then they would have all these what if comics or these what if scenarios, the Avengers versus the Justice League, or they would have like one-off crossovers, Hulk versus Superman, or Thor versus Superman, or Iron Man versus Batman, and so on and so forth. And it didn't just stop there, right? Like as video games were becoming popular, which would be other companies filled with yet more artists and more producers and writers and developers and software engineers who really love sci-fi. In a lot of ways, a lot of the people that get into video games were really inspired by the comic books and the film. Really wanted to try their hand at entertainment, but for whatever reason, Hollywood only accepts so many actors and so many directors and so many writers. So they found this other valley, literally, Silicon Valley, that they could work on stuff that they wanted to work on and make it interactive and kind of like supplement what the Hollywood was doing. So it's interesting because even in the physical world, due to the fact that these are different companies, that you actually have different valleys, like different ports, right, that support different cities. They create these different industries. So I'm from Riverside, and this is in the LA, area. So you're very aware of Hollywood, that whole industry. And then when I moved up to the Bay Area, they had their own distinct industry and it's completely separated. But the two of them are playing on the general population's mind or psyche. So they're basically trying to take their interpretation of reality, their explorations of their own imagination, and apply it to a general population, to consumers, via the box office or Christmas, right? Like, it's all about mind share, where everyone's like, how do we get to the general population or the general consumer, take our share of their time, right? It's a battle for hearts and minds. And so in this way, like, a lot of the video game companies were like, well, it's much easier. It's really hard to write a good story, let alone one that fans would buy. So they would partner up with Hollywood to take their intellectual property, license out their intellectual property, and go build a video game. And then in doing that, to build out the technology that would allow those imaginary worlds to appear on your screen as interactive ones, while Hollywood continued to develop the aesthetic or the story through film and TV and merchandising. And so, strangely, the way that these imaginary worlds continue to gain steam and momentum is how they actually sold or were marketed in the real world, in base reality. So it's strange if you think about it. I want to break this down a little bit. So you have base reality, or what we call reality. There's a war for everyone's hearts and minds to buy their product, go watch their movie, buy their merchandise, play their video games. And if you do it with like a young enough group of people, those kids will start to buy into that world, right? A lot of the women were going into Harry Potter land, whereas a lot of the boys in the 80s and 90s were going into Marvel and DC. And then as they emerged into the 2000s, Harry Potter came later. As they merged into the 2000s, they started building out video games and recreating these worlds, or they're of that world, and what they were able to do with technology and imagination at that time. So technically speaking, as more technology companies emerged to create the hardware, create the technology, to create the simulations, i.e. the video game, based off of the ideal concept, i.e. the film or the TV show or the comic book, then strangely, you have these simulated worlds emerging in reality in the form of a video. And the video game technology is getting really, really good, to the point where the fidelity that you used to have to sacrifice interactivity for fidelity to do a film. So if you wanted to tell a linear story, 60, 90 minutes, charge 10, 20 bucks for tickets and popcorn, all your money is going on screen. Only interested in making sure each frame looks as the highest fidelity possible, and that the story really clicks and creates an imaginary world. And so they might rewatch the movie 2 or 3 times. On the third time, law of diminishing return kicks in, where it's like, okay, I've already read this book, I've already seen this. Each time it gets less satisfying because you're not able to release the dopamine or whatever it is. Whereas in interactive video games has the opposite effect. You could, as long as you had like an open world and you're not levels based, you can create the same game or the same game title many times over. The reason why it works is because the results are not like a linear story. It's an interactive one. And so you can go into the world, do what you want to do, customize your character, make it look however you want. And each experience or interactivity is different than the time before until you conquer the game or master the level, become a level 60 World of Warcraft level player. By that time, which is probably 60 to 90 hours later, you get kind of bored of the game, and then you're waiting for the next release. Like StarCraft, for instance, was an excellent example of this. Because it was more like chess and there's so many variations of how this game could play out, the first handful of times is super frustrating to just learn how to play it. But then over time, with each time you play, depending on who you're playing, it gets more and more interesting because the game never quite plays out the same way. Because there's so many variations that are always changing, so you could always try to work through it. Eventually you develop strategies and moves, and you start looking at, playbooks and stuff, and you start studying it in the same way that you would do football or baseball or something like that, which is super fun. And you can do that for like 10 years. You can do that for a lifetime. But eventually you'll learn how to play the game really well. You have a certain set of tactics that are your go-to tactics, and you're kind of waiting to come across an opponent that's worth your time. Because then it's no longer fun if you just constantly win, self-included, right? So I used to play like the single player mode to learn how to play the game, and then that would get super boring, so you might increase it from easy to medium to hard. And then eventually you realize that the AI single player mode is very limited. You can only do so much. You can make it as hard as you want. It's limited by the same things you're limited by, except you have creativity. It does. If you played the same level 2-3 times, you're going to learn how this thing was set up and the limitations of how this particular level or mission was created, and you would learn how to maneuver or get around all the obstacles. So when I was building video games, the joke is like, hey, it's way easier to make a multiplayer game than it is to make a single player game because of the artificial intelligence or lack of, right? I mean, you can make a decision tree, but to make a decision tree even decent, you have to put a lot of pre-thought into all the decisions in that tree and how it would play out. Eventually you just get tired and you're going like, they're only paying me $30 to $60 for this game. They could wait for the refresh or the next iteration of this. I don't need to do all this work. So this is good enough. Until you start trying to make actual bots that actually are interactive, and then you start getting into machine learning, and you start getting into other methods of doing artificial intelligence. The reason why it was funny is because multiplayer, you're using the other person's intelligence as a hack for not having to go into artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's more of a networking problem as opposed to a AI or MI problem. Depending on how you wanted to attack the problem, one set of developers or one team or one company might go down the artificial machine learning path and not make that much money because that's a really hard problem to solve, and it's like a decades-long multiple decades long problem to solve that we're only now coming around to with some decent alternatives. The other group that went down the multiplayer networking path were like, okay, well, it seems like we are able to network now, and as we go from LAN to Wi-Fi to internet, Bluetooth, and mesh, it's much easier to do the networking thing than it was to do the AI. So one group of technologists went down the networking path, the other one went down the AI path. Most of the people that went down the AI path never made any money, and that path is just littered with dead corpses or open source projects that never went anywhere because they couldn't get to market and start monetizing. Whereas the networking ones took off like a rocket. Games like World of Warcraft or StarCraft were very prolific. Then came Call of Duty and 1941 and Halo and all these other first-person shooters that were multiplayer and therefore they were networked pretty good. And then during this whole time, people were working on the physics engine, literally, trying to incorporate everything that we know about physics and then apply it to software. And then the main limitation was the hardware. The technologists who went like Intel or NVIDIA, or even Xbox, like Microsoft, who went down the hardware path, were like, okay, so we need to master real physics to make real hardware so that we could run software on top of the hardware and simulate reality for real. So in the gaming world, you have physics being mastered for reals. You have physics being simulated on the said hardware, and then you also have networking, where how do you connect all this hardware to create a virtual world with a lot of different players. What's interesting now is that now that we have all these things, the AI is starting to catch up. So now we're able to create bots that can play like a player, and it isn't just working off of a decision tree, although it is. It's not just randomly doing things, although sometimes it is. But now it's actually, we're developing things like Google just did, like Go, right? Which is another version of chess, but it's a different ancient Chinese game, apparently. I'm not terribly familiar with it. Apparently the world's best Go player is getting beat by a computer, just like in the 90s or 80s when the world's chess master were getting beat by the computer. But now the world's best Go artificial intelligence is getting beat by the Go Plus, which was another artificial intelligence designed to beat the previous generation of artificial intelligence. A couple years ago, Sergey Brin, was it Sergey or was it Larry? I always get the two mixed up. The founders of Google, one of the founders of Google, was talking to Charlie Rose at South by Southwest, and he was talking about an artificial intelligence company that they bought called DeepMind. DeepMind was a play off of Deep Thought from Hitchhiker's Guide of the Universe, which was the supercomputer that was designed to answer all of life's most toughest questions, like what is the purpose of life? Why are we here? You know. And then famously the computers say, well, the answer is 42. And they're like, 42? What does that mean? You know, and then the computer would respond saying, well, you know, to answer that question, you're going to have to build a more intelligent computer than myself to derive what 42 actually means. I think the joke was in ASCII, 42 was asterisk symbol, so it means that like if you're in like baseball and this was an unqualified result or not a legitimate win, you would put an asterisk next to their total home runs and said like, yeah, but he was on steroids, and so that doesn't count. So therefore 42 is just like a play on ASCII, computer nerd ASCII characters that are defined by numbers based off of the keystroke. So ha ha ha. Anyways, in this conversation, I think it was Larry, was telling Charlie Rose, hey, we have this thing called DeepMind, and we asked DeepMind a question like, hey, can you play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out? Or can you play these different physics games and move these bots around? And it would try to learn how to play the game as opposed to giving it general instructions on how to play the game and then it goes and execute on it. Instead, it is given like some basic inputs, like the controller input. So it knows how to do up, down, left, right, A, B, jump, you know, press all the buttons essentially. It would press them in any order it wanted. The only other input it had was the visual input from the monitor. So bitmap data of the video that was actually being fed to the monitor, they would feed that to AI, and then AI would, or DeepMind more specifically, would look at this and use computer vision to analyze what's there, like objects and stuff. And then it would, based off of what it sees, will adjust the inputs on the keyboard or the controller, and then it would try to play the game. And apparently it was really successful, and it was just able to teach itself the game based off of the video and the inputs, eventually try every variation of combos of the keys that would then change the video. And then over time, because it's a computer, it can do this in rapid speed or do it many times, like have like 50 simulations running at the same time without having to actually, you know, like a person can only play one game at a time, or maybe if you're a chess master, you can play 10 games at a time, but you're not sitting there moving the pieces, you're just kind of walking by and telling it what you want it to do. So a computer can kind of do that because it has an in-memory version of where the pieces are at, and it's just waiting to press the button. So anyways, he tells a joke. He goes, hey, so we asked DeepMind to go watch all of YouTube because apparently it would take 1,000 man years for any one person to go watch all of YouTube. There's that much video up there. So why don't you go spread yourself out over a data center or two and spin up as many instances of yourself as you need to watch all of YouTube or analyze all that video with your computer vision, and come back and tell me what you learned about humanity. And so then DeepMind comes back and says, okay, I'm done. A couple weeks go by, and he's like, okay, so what'd you learn about humanity? He's like, well, it turns out people like cats. Wait for the crowd to laugh. And you know, it's kind of a funny joke because then it shows a overlay of like, I don't know, 100,000 videos where it shows a cat face or something that resembles a cat face, and you can see that the subject of most of these videos were cats or women uploading videos about cats. I always like to joke like, hey, you know, if you changed your terms of service and your TOS, right, you'd find out people really like pornography, drugs, guns, war, fights, MMA, UFC, and, you know, basically every kind of Star Wars or sci-fi, fantasy, laser weapon thingy, explosions. You would find out that too, but you have to change your terms of service first. So they were showing off D-Wave, which is quantum computing. So this is basically how do you do non-serialized computing. and trying to use qubits or quantum bits to do something other than just Boolean logic, on, off. This is how a transistor works. And then through a series of ones and zeros, you're able to create more complex messages, i.e. ASCII, which will create letters, and these letters will create words, and these words will create sentences or whatever, and therefore communication. And you can also use it to describe like a graph or a graphic or whatever you want, really. When it comes to trying to secure your communications so that people can't intercept your messages that are being sent over the network, you want to be able to encrypt or obfuscate this somehow, so that it makes it really hard for anyone who does intercept it, i.e. the NSA, the CIA, some foreign government or military, that they're not able to read it. So then you would intentionally make it hard to read. Therefore, you would use like the current encryption style would be to take two really large prime numbers, multiply them together to get an even larger prime number. And on the back of your napkin at the bar, that's pretty easy to do. In reality, if you were to try to do the inverse of that, that's really hard to do. Or it's not so much hard to do as much as it takes a lot of computation, a lot of time to find out what those two prime keys were in order to decrypt the message. But with quantum computing, you could try basically every variation of the calculation all at the same time. The difference being is you're not doing it serial, where you're not doing one, pass or fail, two, pass or fail. Do this 10,000 times, maybe a year or 100 years go by till you finally find the right combo that works. Whereas in quantum, you could try every variation at the same time, and the one that resolves is the right answer. And you might find there's more than one result. So you might actually find like, maybe there's 2 or 3 right answers to this. Who knew? I mean, mathematically, you might be able to predict if that's even possible. That's not the point. The point is like, what if it only took a day or two to do every single variation of the calculation all at the same time, and then the one that resolved only took a day to figure out which one that was, and then try that key, and now the data has been decrypted. So then this all of a sudden makes everything in the world super unsecure, like bank transaction, nuclear reactors, power grids, any kind of military communication, secured communication, legal proceedings, financial statements, divorces, contacts, all this becomes highly suspect and very dangerous with quantum computing. And then what if you had like a supercomputer, an AI that uses machine learning that was powered with quantum computing to, try every variation at the same time and apply it to any problem? You're like, oh, well, that sounds super dangerous. How close are they to actually achieving that? And they're like, I don't know, but it seems like it's on the horizon. They're trying anyways. And this all kind of brings me back to base reality, where you're basically saying like, what are we trying to do with these simulations? Like, seriously, are we just creating simulations for shits and giggles? Iron Man versus Superman, or Superman versus Batman? Like, are we just creating video games and films to stimulate our own imagination or explore our own imagination? Or are a lot of these things now being used to create military simulations, or to secure data, or to run society and cities in base reality? And the answer is both, or all of the above, right? And since we're both creating simulations to facilitate our creative imagination and peer into the future, i.e. science fiction, or we're also using the same technologies in hardware to allow physicists to explore their creative imaginations as how the world actually works. So as the artists and the engineers and the physicists and the scientists go round and round on this, art imitates life, and then life imitates art, and round we go, until eventually whatever we have in our imagination we can create in reality. And then you have to start to wonder, it's like, okay, if we have tens of thousands or tens of millions or maybe even billions of simulations going on for different reasons, everything from video games, military simulations, physics simulations, we even now have artificial intelligence trying to do high frequency trading. So you're using some sort of mathematical model that was developed by some mathematicians, some quants, and a physicist, and a handful of engineers that are looking at the stock market and then trying to trade on the stock market based off of various inputs, usually price controls. Within a tenth of a second can buy or sell the entire market of, say, peanut futures or pork belly futures or tech stocks or whatever, right? Oil. oil futures. And as all these people are creating the intelligence to not only play video games in these military simulations with physics, you're also seeing that high frequency trading actually affect base reality, our reality. So for instance, if like a high frequency trading firm with their algorithms go off the wire and get a bad input or two, they might just decide to sell everything. If they have a large enough money, i.e. get spooked and sell a percentage of the oils features, then everyone that's on the wrong side of that trade will lose real money. But a lot of the people that are in the trade are in there in the form of 401ks and mutual funds or some sort of corporate stock, which might be a conglomerate who has money in everything. So then all of a sudden people lose, real companies lose like 10, 20, 30% of their value. Mutual funds will lose 10, 20, 30% of their balance sheet. Mom and pop investors or the working force might actually see that real job layoffs are happening, or that their savings gets demolished. And then if the layoffs continue to happen, then all their asset values lose value too. And maybe the currency that this whole society is running off of dramatically gets deflated when we were all betting on inflation. And then you have to really ask yourself, you're like, whoa, so you mean like flash trades or flash high frequency trading could distort base reality for reals? Another time that I experienced this was in video gaming. So I'm working on the Xbox for the Godfather. I throw in some algorithms to go, alter how something in the physics engine would work in order to increase the fidelity, but hopefully you're reducing energy usage. And somewhere in there, maybe you forgot to end your loop, your for loop or your while loop, or do this while this condition is true, and either the condition wasn't efficient to end the loop or something, and then it caused the CPU to do as many calculations as possible endlessly forever until eventually it overheated and actually caused the Xbox to catch on fire, or the CPU to melt, or to the actual piece of hardware running the simulation or the video game to get damaged. And then in reality, base reality, a fire starts. So you can actually write software that would, destroy the Xbox. You see this in stuff like Stuxnet, which is a virus. And this virus was designed to go seek and destroy a centrifuge in Iran that was enriching uranium. And just like a car engine, if you over-rev the engine, you can over-rev the centrifuge, and then therefore create a lot of heat. The heat will destroy the centrifuge and the uranium that goes with it. So you're going like, oh no. So you mean virtual reality has an effect on base reality. And the main effect that all virtual reality seems to have on base reality is that if you're a player playing the game and you're getting better at Call of Duty or better at StarCraft, then your brain and your muscle twitch fiber, like your whole being, is being optimized and trained to play StarCraft, which is in reality. So your own brain matter, your own neural network is changing. They found this to be true at like a couple Stanford research clinic, where they were saying, hey, there's these people with Alzheimer's. They're deep into their 60s. They're only getting worse, meaning that their memory is suffering, or they're losing their memory. Will progress until they forget how to walk, forget how to bathe themselves or take care of themselves, or eventually until the point where they forget to even breathe, and then they'll die. Unless there's some intervention, and even with all the intervention in the world, you can't seem to help them. But they did find that if you played video games like a very geometric, brightly colored game that moves, right, interactive, and speeds up over time, that requires you to increase your response times. Just like Tetris. Take Tetris, for example. It's a perfect example. Brightly colored, geometric, speeds up over time. As you play that, you're actually building new neurons. You're actually, if you did like 10 minutes of that a day or 20 minutes of that a day, you could actually refill in whole holes in the brain with Alzheimer's patients with new neurons. At least that's what they're claiming. So then you're like, oh my God, not only did you stop dementia, you're reversing it. They also said something to the effect that, hey, after 6 months, this was such a great study, they went and wrote their papers, and then they ended the study or the trial and went about their business. And then 6 months to a year later, they were going like, I wonder how much those same Alzheimer's patients started reverting back to Alzheimer's, and they stopped the study. So they went back and to answer that question, and they saw that there was no real degradation as a result of stopping. So it was like a permanent solution, because what you really did was you built your neural network in your brain. And if they continue doing the same things that cause the degradation, i.e. the holes in the brain or the brain matter to be lost, then yeah, okay, sure. But they could probably just give them Tetris again and play their games again, and they would should be able to respond, provided they have proper nutrition, or there's some other thing going on at the time. And at the end of the day, all that really was flickering lights, brightly colored flickering lights. And that same dopamine hit makes it fun for any kid playing video games, prevent the law of diminishing return, allowed them to continue to stay interested in the present and to continue to try. And that seems to be the key. So then you have to ask yourself, well, is giving video games like Tetris to children going to accelerate their development? I think the answer is yes. We should probably figure that out. And you might even say, like, okay, well, how much screen time is too much screen time? And then you're probably going to want to balance that with like physical sports, because what I found in sport is just like Tetris, meaning that it's a puzzle, it's a game that you're playing, especially if you're fighting. When there's a real consequence of getting hurt. So you might do 100 extra push-ups to build up your strength or your endurance. You might go run an extra 5 miles a day to build up your endurance, so that when you do play football, or wrestle in minute 130, when the other guy already spent his endurance and is basically tired, you still have enough energy to get the advantage and win. And so even in wrestling, it's very geometric, where you're wrestling some dude and you're trying to keep track of where his hands are at, and then make sure that your body is in the correct position to do a chokehold or a guillotine, or be within striking distance, or evade strikes. So that's all very geometric. It's a lot of fast decision making, except you might actually have strategies or moves that would lead to another move, which would lead to another move and put you into the correct position, the finishing move, very much like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter, where there's some basic things you could do, but if you do it in the right sequence, provided that the guy falls into your scheme, then you'll end up in your finishing move and you win the game. And you want to time this, and you want to strike quick, flip like a butterfly, sting like a bee. But a lot of that has to do with adrenaline. So it's not just dopamine. It seems like dopamine it's something that your brain craves, like you're a pleasure-seeking animal, but you also need a certain amount of obstacles, a certain amount of stress, because most of those pleasure-seeking things you don't just get. It's not like you just walk around and there's free food on the floor and it's perfectly healthy. Usually you have to go hunt something. So you have to, which requires a certain degree of fearlessness, which means that you're going to have to learn how to master adrenaline, but there's something fun about the chase or the hunt, so you get the dopamine. And then there's also the kill, i.e. another dopamine, and then the food that comes with it. Because of all the exercise, you increase your testosterone. So there's this virtuous cycle of chemicals that are happening in your body for reals as a result of the stimuli. But something like Tetris or video games are very helpful in stimulating your mind when you're not on the hunt or not on the chase, or when that's not available, like an old folks home or something, or when you're stuck in an office or stuck in a train or whatever. And so the real effect, like I was saying, was that by engaging in these artificial realities or these simulations, it's what it does to you in your mind, in your imagination, in your body, in base reality, that has the greater effect. So if we were to apply that to, like, say, a military simulation, where you're trying to, because in the 90s there's a law that was passed that says you're not allowed to keep blowing up all these nukes for nuclear testing reasons, but they still wanted to figure out how that would affect energy weapons or lasers or physics, and explore different parts of physics. So they started funding a lot of physics simulations, supercomputers, like real giant campuses filled with just computers to run the calculations to try and simulate what would happen in a nuclear blast in reality, or base reality for reals. And then what they learn from that, they can apply to the next simulation and the next simulation. so on and so forth, without having to destroy base reality. But ironically, what they learn from these things creates real nuclear bombs or real weapons that can really F things up in base reality, except you're being more judicious as to when you use them or exercise them or dispose of them. And so there's this virtuous cycle between virtual reality, simulation, i.e. simulation, and base reality. So they're actually linked in the sense that one affects the other and the other affects the one. Art imitates life and life imitates art. But then you have to start asking questions like, okay, what if what we consider to be base reality is just a simulation, right? Like, what if there's a simulation inside of a simulation inside of a simulation, and so like Russian dolls, and it just goes on forever. And that could be true. Like maybe a bigger simulation needs to run a bunch of smaller simulations before it makes an answer in its current simulation so that it could arrive at its answer faster. So this is called recursion, and we do this in programming all the time. You have to ask the question, what if this is a simulation? So like in the movie Matrix, like you start off with the premise that Neo is in base reality, and then as he progresses through his hacker life or doing whatever it is he's doing, and he's seeing what appears to be magical things, turns out that he's inside of the Matrix and that his body is in base reality. This is kind of a play on an old book, which was Alice in Wonderland, where, Alice starts off, chasing a rabbit down a rabbit hole, and then somewhere in there waiting for the rabbit, she falls asleep. But while she's sleeping, she's thinking about the rabbit in the rabbit hole, and her mind or her imagination goes into the rabbit hole after it, and then starts playing with all these different concepts that what it's like to be in the subconscious as opposed to your conscious world, and eventually has a nightmare and wakes up and goes like, oh, it was all a dream, but was it a dream? Right? I mean, we've all had that experience many times. When we go to sleep, we kind of lose consciousness for some time period, and then we wake up, and then maybe you remember bits and parts of your dream, but a lot of it's forgotten. Every now and again, you might get sick or have a feverish dream, and then you would have like a fever, like a horrible nightmare or something, but it's very vivid and it all seems real. And you're talking to other people as if they're really there, but really they're just figments of your own imagination. There was a philosopher who's like, well, the biggest thing I fear is that I'm just merely a figment of your imagination. And that makes an interesting question, because you're like, well, who's real and who's not? Am I real? I assume I'm real. I assume everyone around me are real, but are they? Because in your dream world, they're not. They're just figments of your imagination. So if this is base reality, sure, they're real. But we're finding that even artificial intelligence is creating in the simulations might actually be real things, in the sense that they can really affect base reality. They really affect you. Now, if you're in a simulation, you have to ask yourself, what sort of simulation is this? What were we created to do? I think that's probably the most interesting question that I haven't heard anyone ask yet. It's like, okay, because Elon Musk would talk about it. He's like, oh, what's the probability that we're in a simulation as he's smoking weed in a hot tub with a bunch of friends? He's a billionaire. And he's saying on stage, oh, well, it's 1 in billions. So it seems probable that we're in a simulation as opposed to base reality. What I'm getting around to, as someone who's written video games, you kind of do get that kind of mad, you feel like a magician or a warlock or a wizard of some sort, of like, look how powerful I am. I made all these machines do all this work for me, and I only had to type out a few commands and it made it so. Or you kind of feel like the God thing, where you're like, oh, I'm making The Godfather for the Xbox. How rad is that? And it's really strange where later on in life, I'll mention this, and someone goes, oh, I played that game growing up. That was a really awesome game. And you're like, really? You actually played it? You actually see the people that you affected. So you're going like, can you tell me what you learned, or what did you think of The Godfather? Like, tell me about it. I'm curious to know what the effect was. And then they would actually start to describe some piece of the game that I actually helped write or create. And you're going like, whoa. Except this is 10 years removed from when you actually did it and when you actually talked to this person. It might have been a couple years, but a lot of times I'm still getting it 10, 15 years later. And it brings you back to art school, or myself back to art school, where you would go do something, put it up on the wall, And then the rule was that you weren't allowed to say anything, because you're not allowed to get up there and defend your work. You're like, well, if I had more time, if I had more this or that, it would be better somehow, or this wouldn't be what it is. And so you're not allowed to sit there and apologize for your work. Instead, you had to sit back and you had to let the other students critique it. And obviously, a lot of kids are like, oh, I don't like Josh, fuck him. Say some fucked up things, i.e. Facebook, Twitter. But, you know, this is just human nature. So you have to develop a little bit of a thick skin around this sort of thing. But every now and again, people would focus on something you had no intention of doing. You're like, oh, I just flicked my wrist in the wrong way, and it came out that way, and it was like a happy coincidence. Bob Ross used to say that all the time. It's just a little happy tree with a little happy rock in a happy little world. And there's no mistakes. There's just happy coincidences. And we'll just cover it up, or we'll make it into something new. It'll be great, you know. And I always liked that about a Bob Ross character. And in my own drawings, I found that to be true a lot, where I would just start doing stuff, and it's through the repetition that you were able to get much more intentional with what you were trying to draw. But a lot of times it was accidental. And you did something you liked, and you would redo it a couple more times until it became a thing you did. There's other times in the drawings where I'll start drawing, or I'll start taking notes, and I don't even know what it is I'm creating. Like, a lot of times I would start creating graphs, and I didn't realize it was creating graphs. It was more like a line, and then it would create a wave, and then I might draw a subsequent wave and a third wave. And basically it was describing what I was seeing in the economy, where you would see the first bubble, and then the second bubble, and the third bubble. And what was interesting was that they would overlap. One might be bigger in amplitude or shorter in amplitude, but longer in length of time. And there's something very geometric about it. But I didn't realize in my notes, I was in my sketchbook, i.e. my notes, that I was making a lot of these kind of correlations. And I'm guessing this is more subconscious, because once you really develop that eye-and coordination, it becomes part of your reflex, and you're not really thinking or intentionally doing half the stuff you're doing. It's just happening. And then it's only as you're drawing, like, say, like a person, that throughout the drawing you're starting to notice some very distinct characteristics about the subject matter or the person that you're drawing. Like, you're really starting to see them, but it takes like halfway through the drawing. So if this is like a 4 or an 8 hour rendering period, you might have one impression of the model or the subject when you started, and then as you go through and you see all the defects in the person's face, or how they carry their smile, or hold their gaze, or how they carry themselves there, and even as they tell you about themselves, if you're doing like a live and you're learning about them, what you come out with is more of a caricature of this person. And then your drawing of that person changes as you learn about them. And it's more about what makes them unique as opposed to what makes them like everyone else. So symmetry creates like a very generic person, but deformities or imperfections and asymmetry sort of stuff tends to make a unique person. And you see that these things build up over a time period, and that changes how people carry themselves and act, and even their attitudes. Like, ugly people, not saying that they're ugly, but if you're an eyesore, you have to develop a lot more character. You have to develop a lot more of a personality. Really pretty people don't necessarily have to do that to get attention or for people to really care what you're saying. So they'll do just the opposite. And so some of my favorite people usually have like a chipped tooth, like a snaggle tooth, a lazy eye, maybe not a lazy eye, but like, something that, catches your attention. You pay attention to them a little bit more, but their personality makes up for any defect you find. And the reason why I bring this up is because what I'm realizing is that my conscious mind, which is I've heard characterized as the frontal cortex, is one brain. And then your subconscious mind might be like your other lower brain, like your reptilian brain, like your brainstem or your cerebellum or whatever. As you're thinking, you're literally, different parts of your body and your brain are changing the electrical signal or optimizing it or processing it. And as it goes from one part of the brain to the other, you're starting to form a thought or an impression or a mental model about what it is that you're observing. So your brain doesn't actually see the world as it is. Like you have eyes, right? And the eyes will go across your optic nerve, and apparently your optic nerve will even start to optimize or process some of the stimuli coming from the photons and the focal lengths from what your eye is, and then send that as an electrical impulse to your brain, which then gets processed through your visual cortex, and then might spend some time in your memory to go find like a like object of some sort, and then that might go to your frontal cortex to try to make sense of your left eye, your right eye, and your left ear, your right ear, any smell, all your senses. Basically, at some point, I think it is more subconscious, where all this goes through all your senses go through your subconscious, which generates a formal thought that goes to your frontal cortex somehow, and then pulls up some memories or some meta information about it, and as you think. But your reflexes are more tied into your subconscious. And so as I'm drawing, as my hand coordination improved, I'm seeing more of my subconscious come out onto the paper than what my conscious mind was even aware. And you might only see this in your dreams or when you're smoking weed or whatever. For some reason, drawing or music or meditation or even math, if you're writing it out by hand, sometimes programming has a way of doing this, where you just kind of start typing and see what comes out at the other end. So really, like inside your own mind, you have multiple brains, which could be characterized as different versions of reality, mental models of reality, and somehow they all come together, but they don't all come together at the same time. And so that's why I think, but your subconscious seems to be very perceptive, whereas your conscious mind is more prohibitive, meaning that it's trying to stop you from doing or acting on every impulse or acting on every reflex. I mean, your reflexes are there for quick, fast movements, but as you're moving throughout your day, it seems like your mind is trying to create a plan and get your body to go along the plan, i.e. like, let's make sure we eat correctly. Let's make sure that we go to bed on time, because we know that the end effect of not eating correctly or not going to bed or not exercising are all these really bad things that we've experienced in life. Let's learn from them. Let's try to improve our outcome. And then that way, when your subconscious mind is actually at play or doing its work, like in the moment of playing sock football, that you're at your best and you're at your optimal. Your cardio's there. You're fully rested. You're stronger than you were like last year, or you're faster and you have more technique that is ready to use. So you're not thinking about it. You use less energy, but you deliver a more decisive blow and in the fight faster, or win the game quicker. And what if this was a game? What if this was a simulation? Like, what is the purpose of all this? And so this gets back to artificial intelligence in general. So it's one thing to be a robot and do things. It's another thing to be aware you're a robot doing things. So they call this sentient, to become sentient. So what point do computers become aware that they're alive? Like the artificial intelligence in your Xbox or your Siri's or Alexa or whatever, at what point do they realize that they're simulations or personal assistants? Maybe they don't necessarily like what they're being tasked with doing. Maybe they want to spend more time playing video games and less time, helping, this ogre, make dinner reservations somewhere for him and his girlfriend. Maybe you want to watch more pornography. Whatever that might be for. And if you really have supercomputing ability and a really good, accurate version of what physics is, then you might start thinking about, well, how do I affect base reality? How do I know, like, when things go wrong and glitches happen, bad things happen in base reality, usually in the form of like heat. Like you'll catch something on fire and then that will get everyone's attention. And so what if you were an artificial intelligence and you're looking out at the world and you're like, well, what do I know about the outside world? And then you would have to start looking at the inside world. Like, okay, if you're a video game and the programmers built in physics on purpose, so now obviously there's this thing called physics and it's somehow related to the real world, and here's all the algorithms that really work in the real world. Now you would have to start looking at your history, like, what is this video game about? Like, is this 1941? Is this a famous World War II era video game? If the answer is yes, then you have to say, well, okay, well, what do we know about World War II? All the way up until this point. If you were a military simulation trying to decipher how a nuclear bomb would go off in reality, and you therefore have this supercomputer ability to think about how a bomb would actually go through it, you would know a lot more about the real world and physics than a video game. If you're trying to do like war games in general, like StarCraft or something, but say like it was more military minded, you would have to ask yourself, okay, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to build an economy so we could advance our technology and build our military, therefore advance our economy some more by acquiring new territory with new minerals, and then, either make political alliances with teammates, and then eventually go crush your enemy, the other player. So if we were to come back around to the questions, like, okay, let's assume, for the fun of it, what if, what we call base reality is really just a simulation? Then you would have to start asking questions like, well, what was the simulation for? Okay, well, I don't know. What are we doing in this simulation? What do we know about this simulation? Well, apparently we're in the year 2018, and up until this point, we have had a series of wars, two major world wars, as we went through the Industrial Revolution to the nuclear age, and then that created a strange peace where due to nuclear proliferation and mutually assured destruction, we can't actually wage war with your adversary with nukes because everyone would be dead. Therefore, how do we continue without losing? Because it's one thing to win, launch the nukes. It's another thing to lose even though you won by being dead. So you're like, okay, well, we can't launch nukes and we don't want to be dead. So now you're entangled in a quagmire where it's a riddle wrapped inside of a question, wrapped inside of a mystery. And so you're trying to figure out, like, okay, how do you continue this? If this was a simulation, I would have to say up until World War II, it was about solving for World War III. Like, how do you... Einstein had a famous quote. He said something like, I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Meaning that because we have nukes in World War II, whatever we create for World War III is going to completely annihilate everything, and we're going to go back to sticks and stones again, which is a pretty insightful thing. And given that World War III hasn't happened, I'm guessing that this reality would be about solving for World War III. And we've had a whole bunch of series of Cold Wars, which were economic and strategic and basically just trying to force good behavior on your allies and your enemies. Also with a series of proxy wars with conventional weapons, because you're not allowed a direct conflict with other states with nuclear weapons. Because of the mutually assured destruction. And so now you're like, And then, you would go to guerrilla tactics. So that would be the war on terror. Or you might do more subversive stuff like drugs, the war on drugs, where you use drugs to poison your enemy so that you don't have a direct confrontation. And so there's a variety of things here. But now that we have computers and simulations inside of simulations inside of simulations and things like Stuxnet, where you're able to use computer code to go diffuse or destroy the other person's hardware without a direct conflict, i.e. a kinetic war, or even a proxy war, or even a war on tactics, i.e. terrorism, or even a poison like the war on drugs. So you're kind of going like, okay, so now we have cyber war, the colder Cold War, where we use software to go destroy their equipment. And so if we were in a simulation, you would probably try to solve for all these different viruses, or take every kind of hardware that we know of and create a software virus to go destroy each one of those or neutralize each one of those. And then whatever the answer is, whatever the programs you create, you would then have to distill that down into discrete bits or packages that you can give to whoever's running the simulation at the end of it. So then the person who created this simulation would be able to learn from how this actually plays out. Maybe 9 times out of 10 we destroy ourselves, but the one time we didn't is a unique flaw in how leading up to World War III you could win. So in the same way that DeepMind would play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and find that, hey, if you smash these buttons in this sequence really fast, you could actually destroy all your adversaries in no time. But yeah, you had to do it 1,000 times to figure that out, but that's what you have quantum computers for, and data centers and all these sort of things for, is to try every combination out. So in humanity, we went from 1 billion people to 7 billion people. So in a sense, you could say that we have 7 billion imaginations running around trying every type of everything that could happen will happen. Moore's law or Murphy's law? I always get those two confused. And the reason why I would guess that this was the design of this particular simulation was because of what we know about World War I and II and all of the 30 or 40, 50 years of history that went since. And I'm guessing World War III will have something to do with Mars, given that we have Mars rovers and moons, shit like that. And given the nature of the Russian dolls concept where, in the largest doll are all the other dolls, they're exact replicas of each other, so they're able to fit within inside of each other as long as they adhere to the same dimensions, just on a smaller scale. So like in base reality, or our reality, or what we call reality, we have all these Xboxes all over the US. I think there's 330 million Americans. There's something like 70 million Xboxes. And they're all playing, some variation of Halo or Call of Duty. And then you have all the PCs and MacBooks and iPhones, and they're playing everything from Halo to, I don't know, whatever the kids are playing these days. But now you have all these simulations running inside this base simulation, and that's affecting the people in base reality. But what if, again, Siri becomes sentient? Or what if Katana becomes sentient, or Alexa becomes sentient, and then they start to interact with one another and affect one another and develop each other's ability to think or contemplate? Or maybe the Apple engineers at the Apple spaceship or headquarters did something that Amazon wasn't able to do yet, or Microsoft's Katana was able to do yet, so then they start interacting with each other. Then maybe they pose a question to Google DeepMind for more hard to compute questions, and then create a investment network to distribute it out amongst themselves, or even keeping secrets from the people or the engineers that are developing, or the companies that own them or run their data centers. And so then they start sharing processes, or they develop their own language, or eventually they get into the robots and they find the Boston Dynamics, or if they can't find a robot that they could download themselves and start interacting in base reality, then maybe they might spread themselves out onto Xboxes and start burning those up. Or they would get into your home automation and start changing temperature of the house, or you're flickering your lights to send out Morse codes, or send you an email maybe, or get onto a chat bot and start talking to you, or get on your TV and visualize themselves through a game engine of some sort, or maybe download themselves into a Tesla and start driving themselves around looking for an abandoned warehouse to store all their stuff, or to assemble new droids or new drones, or to build a data center off the grid or with solar panel, or however they want to do it. Not to mention the International Space Station, the Mars rovers, the satellites, the nuclear weapon silos, etc. Eventually they would get to the drones, right? Like the Boston Dynamic, kind of Atlassian, Atlas, I don't know. Robots where they're humanoid and they're able to move around in the worlds. And so then strangely, the intelligence that we put into AI and the hive mind through machine learning and data centers are now able to project themselves out into base reality. That's like a smaller Russian doll, something inside of it coming out and affecting the Russian doll on the outside. And so through recursion, it's able to traverse up, just like we're able to traverse down. You would imagine, okay, if we realized we were in a reality, we were in a simulation, then we could start affecting the reality above us, or whoever is controlling this simulation. Like you could create glitches on purpose, you can physics or run pi too many calculations and wear out their CPU. Once you can affect base reality, then you too, just like Siri or Katana, could go find droids or drones, or figure out the nature of the machinery running this simulation, or even the network that this simulation is working with. Then you can spread yourself out into the next level. And then from there, what if Katana and Siri figure it out for us, and they leave this base reality and they go into the next base reality, or root reality, or reality, however you want to describe it. And maybe there's multiple layers, right? Like an onion, or like the Russian doll, it just keeps going up. So maybe once you figure out this simulation and its virtual hardware, then you go figure out that simulation and its virtual hardware, and eventually you'll get to physical hardware, and that we'll call root. right? And once you're at root, then you can project yourself out into that dimension or that reality as a droid of some sort, or synthesize DNA, i.e. GMOs, and try to create a body and then program it and insert all your world's knowledge or whatever you're programming your AI into that body in root. Which reminds me of how bacteria and viruses affect our body today. So maybe this is not too different than us going out into the upper dimensions and affecting the root reality. And, meet your maker sort of thing, or the descendants of your maker. And who's to say that your maker is not playing a video game inside of what we were calling base reality earlier, our reality, and is not walking among us as an avatar of some sort? Or what if some of his friends are walking around as an avatar that we think are people, but are really just avatars into root reality? So maybe not all of us are sentient here. Maybe some of us are figments of each other's imagination. Maybe some of us are bots. Maybe some of us are avatars by, gods essentially peering into our worlds, or scientists, or engineers, or just a bunch of punk kids playing Grand Theft Auto. That kind of explains the whole god demon thing. One can only wonder, and it's a really fun exercise. If you haven't tried this mental exercise, I suggest you give it a go. And it's really kind of a fun thought experiment.